It was a rainy Friday night, the kind that seemed to draw out all of life's quiet, hidden corners. The cafe was empty except for Lila, seated in her usual spot by the window. From there, she had the perfect view of the darkened streets, the gentle patter of rain against the glass, and the muffled hum of the city winding down. The warmth of her coffee cup offered a small comfort against the chill that lingered in the air. These moments of solitude were her sanctuary, moments where the world outside felt distant and safe. But tonight was different. An unease simmered beneath the surface, a restless feeling that had been building all evening. Perhaps it was the storm outside, its turbulence mirroring the Cassie often buried within herself. Or perhaps it was the quiet of the cafe, now too silent, too still. It felt as though the universe was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Her fingers hovered over the edge of her book, the words blurring into nothing as her thoughts drifted. She hadn't been back here in months. Life had become a series of carefully constructed routines, designed to numb the pain and keep the past at bay. She was content, or so she told herself, with the life she had built in the aftermath of it all. But the past had a way of creeping in, no matter how tightly she tried to shut the door. The faint vibration of her phone startled her, breaking the stillness, a message notification. Her heart skipped a beat, though she couldn't say why. She glanced at the screen, its glow casting shadows on her face. The number was unfamiliar. There was no name, just a message. "I need to see you. It's urgent. Trust me." The words felt like a whisper from the past, an echo she hadn't expected to hear. The urgency of the message tugged at something deep within her. She knew she should dismiss it, delete it, move on. But a voice in her chest told her she couldn't. Her fingers hesitated over the screen. "Who is this?" she thought. The question was sharp, invasive, but curiosity and fear held her captive. She scrolled up, hoping for context, but there was none. Just those same words, echoing in her mind. "I need to see you. It's urgent. Trust me." Lila stared at the message, her mind whirling. The word trust gnawed at her. Trust whom? Trust what? Her thumb hovered over the screen, torn between replying and ignoring it entirely. The cafe's stillness pressed down on her. She glanced around the room. The barista, a young man with headphones slung around his neck, was wiping the counter absently, his focus elsewhere. Outside, the storm raged on, wind and rain battering the windows. The world beyond felt distant, blurred by the rain's relentless rhythm. Another buzz. Her phone vibrated in her hand, startling her. She opened the new message before she could think better of it. "I need to see you, now, please." The urgency of the words sent a shiver down her spine. The voice in her chest grew louder. "Don't ignore this." Her gaze shifted back to the barista. He was humming softly now, unaware of her growing unease. She felt suddenly exposed, as though the message had drawn a target on her back. Then the cafe door swung open. A gust of wind swept through, bringing with it a man soaked from the rain. His dark hair clung to his forehead, and his coat dripped water onto the tiled floor. He paused just inside the doorway, his eyes scanning the room, until they locked onto hers. Lila froze. His gaze was intense, too intense, holding her in place as though he could see right through her. Something about him was unsettlingly familiar, yet she couldn't place it. He moved toward her, his footsteps soft but purposeful, the storm outside forgotten in the weight of his presence.
"Lila,"
he said, his voice low and steady. The sound of her name felt like a shockwave, pulling her further into the moment. She swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. "Who are you?" she managed to whisper, her voice trembling. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slid into the chair across from her, uninvited. His eyes didn't waver, as though he was measuring her reaction, deciding how much to say or how much to withhold.
"I think you've been waiting for me,"
he said at last. Her stomach nodded. How did he know her name? And what did he mean by that? Lila wanted to get up, to leave, but her body refused to move. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her curiosity rooted her in place. The man's presence was magnetic, his voice calm, yet carrying a weight she couldn't ignore. "Who are you?" she repeated, firmer this time, though her voice still quavered. The man's expression softened, but his gaze remained unwavering.
"My name is Jonathan," he said, "and whether you know it or not, you've been waiting for me."
Her pulse quickened. The barista was still at the counter, oblivious. The room suddenly felt too small, too quiet, as though the world beyond the rain-streaked windows had ceased to exist. Jonathan reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small envelope. It was worn, the edges frayed with age. He placed it on the table between them and slid it toward her.
"This is for you,"
he said. Her hands were clammy as she picked it up, her heart hammering against her ribs. Slowly she opened it, pulling out a photograph. It was her! She was standing at the edge of a cliff in the mountains, her hair whipping in the wind. The sky above was overcast, heavy with the threat of rain. She didn't recognize the place, nor did she remember the moment, but there was no mistaking it. She was in that photo. The word barely escaped her lips as her mind scrambled for an explanation. She looked up at Jonathan, her voice catching. "What is this? Where did you get this?" Jonathan's expression darkened.
"It's time you learned the truth before it's too late,"
he said. Lila's eyes darted between Jonathan and the photograph in her trembling hands. The cliff, the mountains, the overcast sky. It was all foreign to her. She couldn't recall ever being there. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her chest tightened, each word a struggle against the mounting dread. "How do you have this? I've never—"
"You don't remember?"
Jonathan interrupted, his tone calm but heavy with implication.
"But you were there. This photo. It's real."
Her breath hitched as she stared at him. "I don't remember this," she repeated more forcefully now, willing herself to reject the absurdity of his claim. Jonathan leaned forward, his voice dropping.
"That's because you're not supposed to."
The air between them felt charged, thick with unspoken truths. Lila's pulse quickened as the weight of his words settled over her. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her fingers tightening around the photo. "What does that mean?" Jonathan hesitated, his jaw tightening as though he were debating how much to tell her.
"This photograph isn't just a memory," he said finally. "It's a warning."
Her stomach turned. "A warning? From who?" Jonathan's gaze was steady, but his voice softened.
"From someone who knows what you're running from, someone who knows what you've forgotten."
Lila's grip on the photo faltered. The edges of the image felt rough against her fingertips, grounding her even as her mind spiraled. She tried to focus, to make sense of his words, but they felt like fragments of a puzzle she didn't know how to solve. "I haven't forgotten anything," she said, though the words rang hollow even to her. Jonathan's expression darkened.
"You have, and it's why you're in danger,"
he said quietly. The word danger sent a shiver through her. She glanced around the cafe again, the cozy space now feeling like a fragile bubble on the verge of bursting. The barista was still wiping down the counter, oblivious to the storm brewing at the corner table. Outside, the rain continued to pound against the windows, each drop a steady drumbeat of unease. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her attempt to sound firm. Jonathan's lips pressed into a thin line.
"I'm someone who's been trying to protect you, but I can't do that if you don't trust me."
The words struck her like a blow. Trust. The message on her phone echoed in her mind. "I need to see you. It's urgent. Trust me."
"Protect me from what?"
she pressed. Jonathan hesitated again, his silence heavy with things left unsaid. Finally, he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper.
"The man who took this photograph,
he said, nodding toward the picture in her hand.
he's watching you, and he's not alone."
Lila felt the blood drain from her face. The cafe suddenly felt too small, its walls pressing in on her. She glanced toward the windows, half expecting to see shadowy figures lurking in the rain, but all she saw was the storm's relentless fury.
"You're lying,"
she said, though her voice was weak, uncertain.
"I wish I were."
Jonathan replied.
"But you need to believe me. He's been watching you for years, waiting for the right moment, and now he's closer than ever."
Her hands shook as she placed the photo back on the table. "Why?" she asked, her voice cracking.
Me, what does he want?"
Jonathan's expression was unreadable, but there was something like regret in his eyes.
"It's not just about you, Lila. It's about what you know, what you've forgotten, and what they'll do to make sure it stays that way."
The words hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. Lila's mind raced, searching for answers that refused to come. Her life, her memories. They felt like a mosaic shattered by Jonathan's revelations, the pieces scattered too far apart to make sense. Before she could respond, the bell above the cafe door jingled, and a gust of cold wind swept inside. Lila's heart stopped. A man stepped through the doorway, drenched from the rain. His clothes clung to his frame, water pooling at his feet. He moved with deliberate slowness, his presence filling the room like a shadow stretching across the walls. Jonathan stiffened, his body going rigid as his eyes locked onto the newcomer. Lila didn't need to ask, she knew. It was him. The man from the photograph. The air in the cafe seemed to freeze as the man stepped inside. His dark hair clung to his forehead, and his coat dripped with rain, forming a small puddle at his feet. His eyes, sharp and unrelenting, scanned the room until they settled on Lila. Her heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to look away, but his gaze held her like a vice, rooting her to the spot.
"Lila."
Jonathan's voice broke through the fog of her fear, low and urgent.
"Don't react. Don't let him know you recognize him."
But she couldn't stop staring. Her mind raced as the pieces Jonathan had laid before her began to snap together. This wasn't a coincidence. The man wasn't here for coffee or shelter from the storm. He was here for her. The barista greeted the newcomer with a cheery,
"Rough night, huh?"
The man ignored him. His eyes never left Lila. Jonathan leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper.
"Lila, listen to me. We need to leave, now."
Her breath caught in her throat as the man began walking toward their table. Each step echoed in the silence, louder than the rain battering the windows.
"What does he want?"
she whispered, her voice trembling.
"I'll explain later."
Jonathan said, his tone sharp.
"But we can't stay here."
Lila's pulse quickened as Jonathan stood abruptly, blocking her view of the man. The sudden movement drew the stranger's attention to him, his expression shifting slightly. It wasn't surprise, it was recognition.
Jonathan.
The man said, his voice calm but laced with something darker. Lila's stomach dropped. Jonathan didn't flinch.
You're wasting your time.
He said, his voice steady.
She doesn't remember.
The man's gaze flicked to her, and a faint, chilling smile tugged at the corner of his lips.
Not yet.
Jonathan tensed. Lila could feel it, the energy radiating off him like a coiled spring ready to snap. The barista, still unaware of the thick tension in the room, called out,
Can I get you anything?
The man replied without looking away from Lila. Her throat felt dry. She wanted to move, to speak, to demand answers, but fear paralyzed her. Jonathan reached for her wrist, his grip firm, but not painful.
We're leaving.
He said, his voice leaving no room for argument.
Don't make this harder than it has to be.
The man warned, taking another step closer. Jonathan didn't respond. Instead, he pulled Lila to her feet and guided her toward the door. The man didn't try to stop them, he simply watched, his presence heavy and suffocating. As they stepped outside, the storm swallowed them, rain drenching Lila instantly. The cold bit at her skin, but it was nothing compared to the fear twisting in her chest. Jonathan didn't let go of her wrist, pulling her quickly down the street. The sound of their footsteps splashing through puddles was lost in the roar of the downpour.
Jonathan?
She gasped, struggling to keep up.
What is happening? Who is that man?
I told you.
He said, his voice tight.
It's been watching you. He's part of the reason you're in danger.
Lila pulled against his grip, forcing him to stop. Rain streamed down her face as she glared at him, her fear giving way to anger.
No more riddles. I want the truth, now.
Jonathan sighed, his shoulders sagging. For a moment, he looked like a man carrying the weight of the world.
Dan
He said finally.
is connected to everything you've tried to forget. He's part of the reason your memories were taken. And if we don't keep moving, he'll make sure you never remember.
The rain seemed to grow louder as his words sank in.
What memories?
Lila asked, her voice trembling.
What did I forget?
Jonathan's expression softened, but his eyes were filled with sorrow.
It's not what you forgot, Lila.
He said.
It's what they made you forget.
Before she could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed behind them. Lila turned, her heart hammering, as she saw a shadowy figure moving through the rain, coming closer.
They're here.
Jonathan said, his voice urgent.
We have to run.
Without waiting for her response, he pulled her into a sprint, their feet splashing through the flooded streets. Lila's lungs burned and her mind raced, but there was no time to think. The storm swallowed them whole as they ran, the city a blur of shadows and rain. The rain lashed against Lila's face as she struggled to keep up with Jonathan. His grip on her wrist was unrelenting, pulling her through the narrow streets like a lifeline. The city around them blurred into streaks of gray and black, the storm swallowing everything in its fury. Lila's chest burned with every breath, her legs aching as they sprinted through puddles that splashed cold water up her legs. Behind them, the sound of footsteps grew louder, purposeful and relentless.
Who are they?
Lila gasped, her voice barely audible above the roar of the storm. Jonathan didn't answer. He only glanced back over his shoulder, his face set in a grim expression.
We can't stop.
He said. They turned down an alley, the walls on either side looming like shadows. The ground was slick with rainwater, and Lila nearly lost her footing as Jonathan pulled her forward. Her mind raced, tangled in fear and confusion. She had spent years trying to build a life, to move on from a past she barely understood. But now it was chasing her, literally, and there was no escaping it.
Jonathan,
She cried, her voice breaking.
I can't keep running. Tell me what's going on.
He slowed just enough to steady her, his hands still gripping hers tightly.
I promise I'll explain.
He said, his voice strained.
But not here, not now.
A shout echoed behind them, cutting through the storm like a knife. Jonathan's eyes widened, and he pulled her forward again, his pace quickening.
They're closer than I thought.
He muttered under his breath. The sound of their pursuers was unmistakable now, boots pounding against the wet pavement, getting closer with every step. Lila's heart felt like it might explode. Jonathan veered sharply to the left, leading her into another alley. This one was darker, narrower, the walls pressing in on either side. The rain seemed quieter here, muffled by the buildings, but the silence only made the tension worse.
Where are we going?
Lila asked, her voice trembling.
There's a safe house.
Jonathan replied, his tone clipped.
Just a little further.
Safe house? The words sounded absurd, like something out of a spy movie. Lila wanted to laugh, but fear kept the sound trapped in her throat. They reached the end of the alley, and Jonathan paused, his head darting left and right as he scanned their surroundings. For a moment, Lila thought they were safe. But then she saw them, two figures emerging from the shadows, their faces obscured by the rain. There! One of them shouted. Jonathan cursed under his breath and pulled Lila into a sprint. Her legs screamed in protest, but adrenaline carried her forward. The world around them seemed to narrow to just the sound of their breathing, the pounding of their feet, and the relentless pursuit behind them. Finally, they reached an old, abandoned building. Jonathan shoved the door open and they stumbled inside. The sudden silence was deafening, the storm outside muffled by the thick walls. Jonathan slammed the door shut and bolted it, his chest heaving as he leaned against the wood. Lila collapsed onto the floor, her body trembling from the effort of running.
Are we safe?
She asked, her voice weak.
For now.
Jonathan said, though his tone didn't inspire confidence. The room was dark and smelled of damp wood. A single flickering bulb hung from the ceiling, casting eerie shadows across the walls. Lila looked around, her breath still ragged, as she tried to make sense of everything.
Who are they?
She asked again, her voice steadier this time.
Are they chasing us?
Jonathan crouched in front of her, his eyes searching hers.
They're part of the organization I told you about. The ones who took your memories. The ones who want to make sure you never get them back.
Her stomach twisted.
What memories? What could I possibly know that's worth all of this?
Jonathan hesitated, the weight of his silence pressing down on her. Finally, he said, You were part of something, Lila, something big, but they erased it. Wiped your mind clean because they knew you'd never agree to stay silent. You knew too much, and now they think you're starting to remember. Lila's mind reeled. It felt impossible, like something out of a nightmare, but as she stared at Jonathan, she saw the truth in his eyes.
They'll kill me, won't they? She whispered.
Jonathan didn't answer. He didn't need to. The sound of footsteps outside shattered the moment. Jonathan stood abruptly, motioning for her to stay quiet. He moved toward the window, peeking through the cracked glass, his body tensed.
They've found us, he said grimly.
Jonathan's eyes flicked between the window and the door, his body tense as though bracing for impact. Lila crouched lower, her breath shallow, the air in the room thick with the scent of damp wood and fear.
How did they find us?
She whispered, her voice barely audible. Jonathan shook his head, his jaw tight.
They were always going to, we just bought ourselves a little time.
The sound of footsteps outside grew louder. Shadows passed across the thin crack of light beneath the door, and Lila's heart slammed against her ribs.
What do we do?
She asked, clutching the photograph she hadn't realized she was still holding. Jonathan glanced at her, his expression softening for a fleeting moment.
Stay calm,
He said.
let me handle this.
Before she could argue, there was a sharp knock on the door.
Open up.
A voice demanded, cold and commanding. Lila's breath hitched. Jonathan held up a hand, signaling her to stay silent. Another knock, harder this time.
We know you're in there.
Jonathan moved toward the door slowly, his footsteps eerily quiet against the creaking floorboards. He stopped just short of the threshold, his hand hovering over the lock.
Whatever happens,
He said, his voice low and steady.
don't come out until I say so.
No.
Lila whispered, panic creeping into her voice.
You can't.
Trust me,
Jonathan cut her off, his gaze meeting hers.
I'll protect you.
The words felt like a lifeline, fragile but undeniable. Lila swallowed hard and nodded, retreating further into the shadows of the room. Jonathan unlocked the door and opened it just enough to step outside, pulling it shut behind him. Lila strained to hear through the muffled barrier, her pulse pounding in her ears. The voices outside were low, but their tone was unmistakable, hostile, sharp, and edged with menace.
You're wasting your time.
Jonathan said, his voice calm but firm.
She doesn't know anything.
Let us see for ourselves.
Another voice replied, this one smoother, almost mocking.
She's not here.
Jonathan lied.
And even if she were, you won't touch her.
A sharp laugh followed, and Lila felt her stomach twist.
You think you can stop us? You've been running for years, Jonathan. You can't protect her forever.
Lila's fingers tightened around the photograph, her knuckles white. Who was Jonathan really? And why was he willing to risk everything for her? The conversation outside grew heated, the voices rising. Then came the sound of shuffling footsteps. Jonathan moving, the others following. A loud crash shattered the tension. Lila flinched, her heart racing as something heavy thudded against the wall.
Where is she?
The first voice demanded, rage boiling over. Jonathan's response was a low growl, almost inaudible. Lila's hands trembled as she looked around the room. She had to do something. She couldn't just sit there, waiting for whatever nightmare was coming. Her eyes landed on a small window near the ceiling, its glass cracked and dirt-streaked. Carefully, she rose to her feet, trying not to make a sound. The room swayed around her as her pulse thundered in her ears. She didn't know where the window led, but staying here felt like a death sentence. The voices outside escalated. The crash of breaking furniture sent adrenaline surging through her veins. Lila climbed onto a rickety table beneath the window, wincing as it creaked loudly. She froze, holding her breath, but the chaos outside seemed to mask the noise. Reaching up, she pushed at the window. It didn't budge. She gritted her teeth, pressing harder, her palms slipping against the cold, damp glass. A shout from outside made her stomach lurch.
Ah,
Jonathan's voice, loud and commanding. Lila's hands trembled as she gave the window one last push. This time, it moved, the frame groaning as it slid open just enough for her to squeeze through. She hesitated, glancing back at the door. Jonathan was out there, risking everything for her. Could she really leave him behind? Another crash jolted her out of her thoughts. She didn't have a choice. Lila hoisted herself through the window, her body protesting with every movement. The cold night air hit her like a slap as she tumbled out onto wet grass, the storm still raging around her. She lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, before scrambling to her feet. Behind her, the muffled sounds of struggle continued.
"Jonathan,"
she whispered, a pang of guilt cutting through her. But there was no time. She had to run. Clutching the photograph, she took off into the night, the storm swallowing her as she disappeared into the darkness. The storm was unrelenting, sheets of rain soaking Lila to the bone as she ran. Her shoes squelched with each step, the cold seeping into her skin and tightening around her like a vice. The wind whipped at her hair, stinging her face, but she barely noticed. All she could hear was the echo of Jonathan's voice. "Trust me." Her legs burned as she pushed herself forward, darting between narrow alleyways and across empty streets. The city around her was eerily quiet, the usual hum of life drowned out by the storm. She clutched the photograph tightly, the edges cutting into her palm, grounding her against the chaos. Every shadow felt alive, every sound a potential threat. Her breath came in short, ragged bursts as she glanced over her shoulder. No one was following her, at least, not yet. But the fear was there, gnawing at the edges of her mind. Jonathan had told her to trust him, to stay hidden, and she had left him. A wave of guilt crashed over her, nearly stopping her in her tracks. Jonathan had risked everything to protect her, and she had abandoned him. But what choice did she have? If she had stayed, she would have been caught. And then what? Her thoughts spiraled as she turned a corner, the streets narrowing into a maze of alleys. The photograph in her hand felt heavier now, as though it carried the weight of the secrets she didn't yet understand. She stopped beneath the awning of a boarded-up shop, the faint shelter offering a brief reprieve from the rain. Her chest heaved as she tried to steady her breathing. For the first time since escaping the safe house, she allowed herself to look at the photograph again. The image was the same, her on the cliff, the mountains rising behind her like silent sentinels. Her hair whipped in the wind, her expression distant, almost haunted. And then there was the figure. Just a blur in the background, but undeniably there. Watching. A shiver ran down her spine. The man from the photograph. The one who had been at the cafe. Lila's thoughts raced. Jonathan had said she wasn't supposed to remember, that her memories had been taken. But why? What could be so dangerous that someone would go to such lengths to erase it? Her fingers traced the edges of the photograph as her mind searched for answers, grasping at the scattered fragments of her past. But nothing came. Her memories were a blank slate, a wall she couldn't break through. A sudden noise snapped her out of her thoughts. Footsteps. Her heart leapt into her throat as she pressed herself against the wall, straining to hear. The rain made it hard to tell where the sound was coming from, but it was there. Steady, deliberate, getting closer. Lila's pulse quickened. She peered around the corner, her body tense, ready to run. A shadow moved in the distance, blurred by the rain, but it was enough to send a jolt of fear through her. They had found her. Without thinking, Lila bolted, her feet pounded against the pavement, the photograph clutched tightly in her hand. The streets blurred around her as she ran, her breath coming in desperate gasps. The footsteps behind her grew louder, more frantic. She didn't dare look back. Ahead, the alley opened into a park, its sprawling trees swaying violently in the storm. Lila dashed across the open space, her legs screaming in protest. The rain was relentless, the ground slick with mud, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. She stumbled into the cover of the trees, the branches overhead offering some respite from the downpour. Her vision swam as she pushed herself forward. her body trembling from the cold and exhaustion. Finally, she collapsed against the trunk of an old oak, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. The photograph slipped from her grasp, landing in the mud beside her. She wanted to cry, to scream, to let out the fear and anger that had been building inside her since the moment she received that message. But there was no time. Lila forced herself to focus, her eyes scanning the darkness. The park was quiet, save for the howling wind and the rustling of leaves. The footsteps had stopped, but the fear lingered. She picked up the photograph, wiping the mud from its surface with trembling hands. The image was smudged, but the haunting figure in the background was still visible, a silent reminder of the danger she couldn't escape. Her mind raced. She had no plan, no idea where to go. Jonathan had mentioned they wanted to ensure she never remembered. But remembered what? The storm raged on as Lila sat beneath the tree, the photograph clutched to her chest. For now, she was safe. But she knew it wouldn't last. They were still out there, watching, waiting. And she was running out of time. Lila's hands trembled as she clutched the photograph to her chest, the rain now pouring in relentless sheets. She pressed her back against the tree, trying to steady her breathing, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. Her pulse was erratic, and the weight of the photograph felt like a heavy anchor in her hands. She needed answers. She had to understand what was happening, who she really was, why her memories had been erased, and why someone was hunting her down. But every step she took seemed to lead her further into darkness. The photograph in her hand felt like a cruel reminder of everything she didn't know. She couldn't remember being on that cliff. She couldn't remember anything about her past, but the figure in the background of that photo, someone who had been there, watching her, felt too familiar. Lila squeezed her eyes shut, trying to force the memories to come. The storm howled around her, a violent wind tugging at the tree branches, but nothing surfaced. She took a shaky breath and stood up, wiping the dirt from her clothes. Her legs were stiff, but she couldn't stop moving. The longer she stayed still, the more the fear gnawed at her. She had no idea how far she had run, but she couldn't afford to stop. Not yet. The sound of distant footsteps snapped her back to reality. Her heart leaped into her throat, and she darted between the trees, her legs carrying her through the park with little thought. The rain made the ground slippery, and she stumbled several times, but she didn't dare slow down. They were still looking for her. She needed to find somewhere safe, somewhere they couldn't follow. Lila didn't know how much time had passed, but the darkened sky made it clear that hours had slipped away. Her body was aching, her clothes soaked through, and the cold had begun to seep into her bones. She kept moving, though, her mind fixated on the one thing she knew she had to do: find out the truth. She rounded a corner and spotted a narrow street ahead, the streetlights flickering in the storm. The sound of footsteps was louder now, closer, but she didn't dare look back. The alley led to a small building tucked between two larger, decrepit structures. The door was slightly ajar, as though waiting for her. Lila hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing her mind. Should she go inside? Was it a trap? Her heart pounded in her chest, but she couldn't risk being out in the open. With a glance over her shoulder, she pushed the door open and slipped inside, heart racing. The room was dimly lit, shadows dancing along the cracked walls. The air smelled stale, the floor covered in dust. She stepped further in, her eyes adjusting to the dark. There was no sound here, no footsteps, no rain pounding against the walls. Just silence. A figure stepped out of the shadows. Lila froze. It was a woman, tall, with dark, cold eyes that gleamed in the low light. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something about her that immediately put Lila on edge. Commander B began his training, taking a class on armed combat systems.
"You shouldn't be here,"
the woman said, her voice calm but firm. Lila took a step back, her heart hammering.
Who are you?
The woman didn't answer immediately. She simply studied Lila for a moment, her gaze calculating. Then she stepped closer, her footsteps soft against the floor.
"My name is Eleanor,"
she said quietly.
"and I've been waiting for you."
Lila's mind raced.
Waiting for me? Why? What do you know about me?
Eleanor's lips twitched, the faintest hint of a smile on her face.
"I know everything, Lila. I know about the memories they took from you, and I know why they're hunting you."
Lila's chest tightened. The breath caught in her throat. This was it. This was what she had been running from. The answers she so desperately needed.
Tell me everything.
Lila demanded, her voice hoarse.
What happened to me? Why can't I remember?
Eleanor stepped closer, her eyes never leaving Lila's.
"You've been part of something much bigger than you realize. They erased your memories to keep you in the dark. They wanted to control you, to make you forget the truth. But they're not the only ones who want you, Lila."
Lila's heart skipped a beat.
Who else? Who else wants me?
Eleanor's eyes darkened, her voice dropping to a whisper.
"The people who took your memories, who erased your past, are the least of your worries. The truth is much darker than you can imagine."
Lila took a step forward, her fear and confusion battling with a desperate need to understand.
Please, tell me everything.
Eleanor hesitated, her eyes narrowing as though weighing something heavy in her mind. Finally, she nodded, her voice low and steady.
"The truth is, you're not who you think you are. You never were. And the people who've been hunting you, they know that. They know exactly who you really are."
Lila's mind raced as Eleanor's words echoed in her ears. "You're not who you think you are." The woman's calm demeanor only added to the unease building in Lila's chest. She stepped back, her legs shaky beneath her, the weight of everything she didn't know pressing down on her.
What do you mean?
Lila's voice was barely above a whisper, fear lacing every word.
Who am I then?
Eleanor didn't answer right away. She merely watched Lila, her cold eyes calculating, before she spoke again.
"You were never supposed to remember,"
she said softly, her voice steady, but laced with something darker.
You were part of a project, something dangerous. They wiped your memories because you were a threat to them."
Lila's breath caught in her throat.
A project? What kind of project?
Eleanor's lips twitched again, a small, knowing smile that didn't reach her eyes.
"A project that involved people like you, people who had the power to change things, people who knew too much."
Lila's heart pounded, her head spinning.
What power? What did I know? What is this all about?
Eleanor's expression hardened.
"You were part of something, Lila. You were meant to be something. But when they realized how much you understood, how much you could change, they decided to erase you. They thought that would keep you from remembering, from doing anything about it."
But I don't remember any of it.
Lila interrupted, her voice thick with frustration.
I don't remember anything. My whole life, it's like it's been stolen from me. I don't know who I am anymore.
Eleanor's gaze softened, though her face remained inscrutable. She took a step closer, her voice quiet and serious.
"I know it's hard, Lila, but the truth is, you're not just anyone. You were created for a purpose, and now, those who erased you, they're coming for you again. They can't afford to let you remember.
Lila took a shaky step back, the pieces of her fractured life spinning out of control.
Me?
She asked, her voice barely audible.
What makes me so important?
Eleanor's smile faded, replaced by an intensity Lila hadn't seen before.
Because you were the key. The project wasn't just about control, it was about power, about unlocking something, a something within you.
Lila shook her head, the weight of Eleanor's words settling over her like a heavy shroud.
Unlocking what? What's inside me?
Eleanor's eyes narrowed, the tension in the room thickening.
I can't tell you everything right now. You're not ready for all of it. But what you need to know is that they won't stop until you're either dead or under their control.
A chill ran through Lila's spine. The urgency in Eleanor's voice left no room for doubt. She was caught in something far bigger than she had ever imagined.
How do you know all of this?
Lila asked, her voice trembling. Eleanor took a slow, deliberate breath, her gaze never leaving Lila's.
Because I've been tracking them for years, and because I was part of it too.
Lila's eyes widened in shock.
Yo?
Eleanor nodded.
Yes, I was involved in the project. But I got out. I was one of the few who managed to escape before they could erase me.
Lila took a step back, her breath quickening.
You're one of them.
Eleanor's expression softened, but the hardness never left her eyes.
I wasn't always this way. I was just like you, a part of their plan. But I woke up, and now I'm here to help you do the same.
Lila struggled to process what she was hearing. She had always thought of herself as ordinary, someone trying to build a life. But everything had changed in the past few days. Everything about her past, about who she was suddenly up for question.
Help me?
Lila repeated, her voice filled with disbelief.
Oh, I don't even know what's happening. I don't even know who I am.
Eleanor's gaze softened for the first time, and her voice dropped to a quieter, more reassuring tone.
I know it's hard, but we have to move quickly. You don't have much time. They've been tracking you, and they're closing in.
The urgency in Eleanor's voice sent a fresh wave of fear through Lila. She had been running for so long, but it seemed like the danger was always just one step behind her. Lila took a deep breath, forcing herself to calm down, to think. She had no idea who she could trust anymore. But for some reason, Eleanor's presence felt different. Not completely safe, but less dangerous than the people hunting her.
What do I have to do?
She asked, quietly, finally finding her voice. Eleanor's eyes gleamed with a mix of determination and something Lila couldn't quite place.
You need to remember, Lila, that's the only way to stop them. You need to unlock what's inside you before they can control it.
Lila stared at her, unsure if she was ready for whatever truth was about to be revealed, but as she looked into Eleanor's eyes, she knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back now. They were coming, and this time, Lila would have to face them. Lila stared at Eleanor, her mind still reeling from the weight of what she'd just learned. Everything she had believed about herself, about her past, seemed like a lie. How could she be a part of something so dangerous? How could she have powers she didn't even know about?
I don't understand,
Lila said quietly, her voice trembling.
How can I have power? I don't remember anything.
Eleanor's gaze softened, though her expression remained serious.
That's exactly why they erased your memories, she explained, her voice steady. because they knew what you were capable of, and they wanted to keep you from using it.
Lila shook her head, feeling overwhelmed.
What do you mean, what I was capable of? What power do I have?
Eleanor stepped closer, her voice lowering to a near whisper.
You're a part of something called the Project, a series of experiments designed to unlock certain abilities in people. Abilities that can change the course of everything. Your memories were erased to keep you from realizing what you can do.
Lila took a shaky breath, trying to process.
What abilities? I'm just normal.
No,
Eleanor said firmly.
You're far from normal, Lila. You were never meant to be, and now you have to remember.
Lila's chest tightened at the thought.
Remember how?
Eleanor's lips curled into a faint smile.
It's not something you can force. It's there, deep inside you. You just need to unlock it. But you won't be able to do it alone. You need to face your past, confront what's buried in your mind, and trust that the pieces will come back.
Lila's mind raced. Faced my past? She had no idea what that even meant. Her past was a blank canvas, a space where her memories should be but weren't, and now she was supposed to unlock it?
But what if I can't?
Lila asked, her voice cracking.
What if it's too much? What if I can't handle whatever they want me to be?
Eleanor's eyes softened, her tone gentler.
You don't have to do it all at once. The key is to take it step by step. You've already started. You remember fragments, like the photograph? That's a piece of the puzzle.
Lila looked down at the photo still clutched in her hand, the blurry figure in the background haunting her. She wasn't sure what it meant, but it was the only thing she had left of a life she couldn't remember.
What do I do now?
Lila asked, her voice small, full of uncertainty. Eleanor stepped back, her gaze fixed on the street outside.
We don't have much time. They're coming. We need to leave this place.
Lila felt a wave of panic rise in her chest.
Leave? Where are we going? How do I escape from them?
Eleanor turned to face her, her expression fierce.
You need to go to the source. Find the people who were behind the project, the ones who erased your memories. You'll find answers there. And when you do, you'll have a choice.
Lila swallowed hard.
What choice?
To either embrace what you are, or let them take it all from you, again.
The words hung heavy in the air. Lila had no idea what this project was, or why she was at the center of it, but she couldn't deny the urgency of Eleanor's words. If she didn't find out what had happened to her, if she didn't unlock whatever power she was supposed to have, she would lose everything. The sound of approaching cars made Lila stiffen. She stepped closer to the window, her eyes scanning the rain-slicked streets.
They're here.
Eleanor said grimly.
We have to move now.
Lila's heart skipped a beat.
Where are we going?
Eleanor moved swiftly, her voice sharp.
There's a safe house. An old contact of mine. They'll help us, but we can't stay here much longer. They'll find us. And if they do...
Her voice trailed off, but Lila could see the fear in her eyes. It was the first crack in Eleanor's composure, the first hint of vulnerability.
I'll go wherever you say,
Lila said, trying to steady her breath.
Just don't leave me.
Eleanor nodded, her gaze resolute once more. Lila followed her to the door, but before they could step outside, the sound of a door slamming in the distance caught their attention.
They're getting closer,
Eleanor whispered, her voice tight with urgency. With a quick motion, she opened the door and stepped out into the rain. Lila followed, the cold night air slamming into her face like a wall. They moved quickly, ducking between buildings and into the shadows. Every sound felt amplified, the pounding of their feet against the wet pavement, the distant murmur of voices, the storm crashing around them.
Stay close.
Eleanor ordered, her voice low.
Don't stop until we're at the safe house.
Lila didn't hesitate, her fear driving her forward. She had no choice now but to follow Eleanor and hope that somehow, in this terrifying chase, she would find the answers she had been searching for. The rain felt like a relentless barrage against Lila's skin as she and Eleanor moved swiftly through the city streets. The storm hid their movements, but every step felt heavier, each footfall echoing in her mind. The fear gnawed at her. The footsteps were still there, just behind them, too close for comfort. Lila's heart raced as she followed Eleanor through the winding back alleys, barely pausing for breath. The night had swallowed them whole, the dim streetlights barely cutting through the dark. It felt like they were running in circles, the city closing in around them.
There it is,
Eleanor said, her voice low and urgent. Lila glanced up. Ahead, a narrow door tucked between two towering buildings beckoned, its entrance hidden by shadows. She had no idea what lay behind it, but it was their only hope. Eleanor reached the door first, her hand moving swiftly to unlock it. The sound of metal against metal was sharp in the otherwise silent night. As the door creaked open, Eleanor motioned for Lila to follow. Without hesitation, Lila stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim, musty interior. The air smelled of old wood and dust, and the faint light from a single bulb overhead barely illuminated the space. The walls were lined with crates and old furniture, and it looked as if no one had been here in years.
This is it.
Eleanor whispered.
We'll lay low for now. They won't find us here immediately.
Lila stood in the doorway, her pulse still hammering in her chest. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the reality of their situation was sinking in.
How long do we have before they come?
Eleanor paused, her face set with grim determination.
No rush. There is time, but we have time, but they're good at tracking people down. But we have a small window. We need to figure out what they're planning.
Lila moved further into the room, her eyes scanning the surroundings. It felt like a safe haven, but the tension in the air made it anything but comforting. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a warning. Every shift in the shadows, a reminder of the danger lurking just outside. Eleanor glanced at her, a flicker of concern crossing her face.
You're not alone in this, Lila. But I can't protect you forever. You need to find your strength. Unlock the memories they've buried inside you. It's the only way you'll survive.
Lila nodded slowly, though doubt still clouded her mind.
But how do I do that? I don't even know where to start.
You've already started.
Eleanor said softly.
By coming here, by trusting me. The next step is unlocking the memories. You're the key, Lila. You always have been.
The words hit her like a cold wave. The key. She didn't know what that meant, but somehow she felt it. Like there was something inside her, waiting to break free. The photograph, the strange figure in the background, the fractured memories. It was all part of a puzzle she hadn't yet solved. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence, a low, metallic thud against the door. Lila's heart stopped. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Eleanor's face hardened, and she motioned for Lila to stay silent.
They're here.
Eleanor murmured, her eyes scanning the room quickly.
We don't have much time.
Lila's mind spun. She couldn't think, couldn't react fast enough. Her heart raced as the door shuddered again, the sound of pounding footsteps growing louder. Eleanor moved with practiced speed, grabbing a small leather bag from a nearby shelf. She tossed it to Lila.
Take this. We need to go, now.
Lila caught the bag, her fingers trembling as she opened it. Inside was a set of keys and a small folded map. She barely had time to glance at it before Eleanor grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the back of the room. They moved swiftly through a narrow passageway, the door at the end creaking open. Eleanor glanced over her shoulder. "This way," she urged, her voice low but urgent. They emerged into a dimly lit hallway. Lila's legs were sore, her body exhausted, but she kept moving, adrenaline propelling her forward. The map in her hand felt like the only connection to her future.
Where are we going?
Lila asked, her voice tight with fear.
To the safe house.
Eleanor replied.
The real one. We can't stay here long, but it'll give us a chance to regroup.
Lila nodded, her heart pounding, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She glanced down at the map in her hand. There was a marker, a small red circle, but it seemed out of place, too far from where they were now.
Eleanor,
Lila said, her voice trembling.
What's this?
Eleanor glanced at the map, her eyes darkening.
That's where the answers are.
Lila's eyes widened.
But we're not supposed to go there. Not yet.
Eleanor stopped suddenly, turning to face her.
I don't have time to explain everything, Lila, but I promise you, once we're there, everything will change. You'll unlock what's inside you, but we have to get there first.
Lila swallowed hard. She wasn't sure what was waiting for her at that place, but she knew one thing for sure. She had no choice. If she wanted answers, if she wanted to end this nightmare, she had to keep going. The footsteps outside were getting closer. Without another word, Eleanor took off, and Lila followed, her legs aching, her mind racing. The safe house was their only hope now, but Lila couldn't shake the feeling that once they got there, everything would change forever.